I ran an experiment for 30 days. Every time I wanted to explore something online, I navigated directly, typed in a URL, searched the specific term, went to a library catalog, opened the bookmark site. No feed, no recommendation engine, no autoplay, no suggested content of any kind. What I expected was that I'd miss things. What I discovered was something else entirely. I was more surprised, more delighted, and more genuinely engaged with what I found than I had been in years. Not because the content was better, but because I had chosen it. The act of choosing, it turned out, changed the quality of my attention. Algorithms are extraordinary at giving you more of what you've already responded to. That is their design. But there is a subtle cost to that efficiency, one that took me a while to name. They slowly collapse the distance between you and your own existing preferences. Think about what that means. Every time you engage with something, the system takes note. It narrows the aperture just slightly, adjusts the dial toward what it already knows you like. Over time, that refinement feels like personalization, but it might be something closer to a mirror, endlessly reflecting a version of you that has already been captured, already been cataloged, already been filed away under a set of preferences you formed at some earlier point in your life. Real discovery, the kind that surprises you, the kind that occasionally changes you, requires encountering things you did not know you were looking for. There is a word for that in information science: serendipity, the accidental finding, the stumble. And it turns out serendipity has a structure. It tends to happen at the edges of your attention, in the peripheral vision of your curiosity. The algorithm, by design, pulls that peripheral vision inward. It keeps your gaze centered on what has already been mapped. I think about the experiences that have most shaped how I see things, the ideas that reoriented me, the books I found sideways, the articles I read because they happened to be sitting next to something else I was looking for. None of those would have appeared in a recommendation feed calibrated to my previous behavior. They arrived through friction, through wandering, through the slight inefficiency of not knowing exactly where I was going. We have built systems that are extraordinarily good at giving us what we want. But what we want at any given moment is a product of what we already know. It is bounded by what we have already experienced, already clicked, already lingered on. And if the systems around us are designed to stay inside that boundary, to honor and reinforce and amplify the shape of who we already are, then the question becomes, where does growth actually happen? I do not think the answer is to abandon the tools, but I do think there is something worth paying attention to in the texture of how we move through information. Whether we are wandering or being guided, whether we are choosing or being chosen for. That 30-day experiment did not solve anything. It did not make me more productive or better informed in any measurable way, but something shifted. There was a quality of attention that returned, a kind of low-level alertness, a sense that I might encounter something I was not expecting. It felt strangely like being a little more alive in the act of looking. And that made me wonder whether some of what we call engagement, the seamless, frictionless, optimized kind, might actually be the quiet opposite of that feeling. There is a version of the internet that required something from you. Not much, but something. You had to know roughly where you were going, or be willing to wander without a map. Pages were slow. Searches returned blunt, imperfect results. You had to sift through them. You had to make calls about what was worth your time and what was not. And in that deciding, something was quietly happening that we did not have language for yet. We call the upgrades progress. Faster load times, smarter recommendations, content that seemed to anticipate what you wanted before you had even finished forming the thought. Each iteration removed another layer of effort, which felt at the time like pure gain. A friction-free experience was the goal. Seamlessness was the benchmark. Clean interfaces, instant results, zero resistance between impulse and outcome. But effort is not only a cost. Sometimes effort is the thing that makes an experience mean something. The resistance between you and a thing is not always an obstacle. Sometimes it is part of the relationship itself. Think about the difference between having a conversation and being handed a summary of one. The information might be equivalent, the experience is not remotely the same. Something about the struggle to follow, to respond, to hold the thread, that is part of what makes it real. Effort is not friction to be eliminated, it is often the mechanism through which meaning actually gets made. I have been sitting with the idea of friction as a kind of signal. When something requires effort, that effort is data. It tells you something about how much you actually want the thing. It gives you a moment, however brief, to decide whether you are pursuing something or simply being carried toward it by the current. The smoother the path, the harder it becomes to answer that question honestly. We have optimized so much of digital life for seamlessness. The one-click purchase, the autoplay that begins before you have decided to keep watching, the infinite scroll that removes the natural pause between one thing and the next, the pause where you might have thought, is this actually what I want to be doing right now? These are not accidents. They are deliberate design decisions made by people who understood that hesitation is the moment you might change your mind. So the hesitation was engineered away. What strikes me is how completely invisible this shift became. We moved from a web that asks you to navigate to one that carries you, and we mostly experience that transition as convenience, which in a narrow sense it is. But there is a meaningful difference between choosing to go somewhere and being delivered there. One of those experiences leaves a mark on you, the other leaves a data point about you in a system you will never fully see. I am not making an argument for difficulty as a virtue in itself. There's nothing sacred about things being hard. But I do think there is something worth examining in how much effort our digital environments now ask of us, and what we quietly surrender when effort disappears entirely. Attention has weight. When you work even slightly to reach something, you tend to arrive at it more fully present. The search that takes 3 tries teaches you something about what you were actually after. The article you had to hunt down stays with you differently than the one that surfaced in a feed and found you without being asked. Friction is not the enemy of discovery. In a strange way, it might be one of the last places where real discovery still reliably lives. At some point, without quite noticing, you stopped seeing the reflection and started seeing yourself. That is the thing about mirrors. The longer you look, the more natural the image feels. The strangeness wears off. It stops being a representation and starts being the thing itself. Recommendation systems work something like that. They begin as tools. You use a service, the service watches, and over time it starts surfacing things that resemble what you have already engaged with. Reasonable enough on its face, convenient even. But gradually, without announcement, the nature of the relationship shifts. The system stops responding to you and starts shaping what you encounter, and over a long enough timeline, that begins to amount to something more consequential than it first appears. Here is what I find worth sitting with. The profile the algorithm builds of you is not you. It is a record of your clicks, your pauses, your watch time, a kind of fossil of your attention at specific moments, in specific moods, during specific seasons of your life. It captures what you responded to. It has no way to capture why. It cannot hold context. It cannot know that you spent hours consuming a certain kind of content because you were going through something difficult, and that you have since moved through it and come out on the other side, changed, perhaps, in ways you cannot fully articulate yet, but changed nonetheless. The algorithm does not update for who you are becoming. It optimizes for who you were. There is a strange intimacy to this. These systems know things about your behavior that you might not consciously register about yourself, patterns in what holds your attention, tendencies you have never sat down to name. And yet the portrait they assemble is oddly flat. They see behavior. They cannot see intention. They see repetition. They cannot see growth. They track what you clicked, but not what you wished you had found instead. Not the search you abandoned halfway through because you weren't not sure what word to use for what you were actually looking for. What gets left out is precisely the most human part, the capacity to change, to contradict yourself, to become genuinely interested in something you have never been interested in before. I think about what it would mean to have a friend who only related to you based on who you are at a particular low point, who kept offering the same things you had reached for when you were bored, or restless, or looking for some kind of escape. Eventually, you would feel unseen by that friend, even if they were technically giving you what you had once asked for. The mirror would be accurate, and completely wrong. What these systems optimize for is engagement. And engagement, it turns out, is not the same as meaning. You can be deeply engaged with something that leaves you emptier than when you started. You can spend an hour in what feels like a full state, that in retrospect was closer to drift. The system cannot tell the difference. It registers that you stayed. That is enough for the metric. That is where the measurement stops. None of this is an argument that the technology is malicious. The people who built it were largely trying to make something useful. But useful and good are not always the same thing. And a system designed entirely around your past behavior, with no mechanism for accounting for your evolution, has a quiet structural pull toward keeping you near where you already are. It is not a conspiracy. It's just a mirror that never learned how to look away. There's a concept in visual perception called peripheral vision. It is not where you focus. It is a soft, white field around the edges of your gaze, for part of your sight that does not resolve clearly, but notices movement, shadow, something shifting in the corner of the room that pulls your attention before you have consciously decided to look. Curiosity works something like that too. The ideas that end up mattering most do not always arrive through direct pursuit. They arrive sideways, in the margins of something else you were doing, while you were looking somewhere else entirely. A footnote that opened into a field you had never considered. A single sentence in an interview with someone you barely knew, about a subject you assumed had nothing to do with you. The thought that lands precisely because it was not aimed at you. What I keep coming back to is how poorly our current information environments are designed to support that kind of peripheral encounter. Everything is optimized for the center of your attention, targeted, relevant, matched to your stated and inferred interests. The peripheral is exactly what gets cropped out, cleanly, efficiently, as a feature rather than an oversight. And that matters more than it might seem. Because peripheral vision, in the intellectual sense, is where a significant amount of growth actually happens. Not in the confirmation of what you already find interesting, but in the accidental brush with something that quietly reorients you. The stumble, the tangent, the thing you almost skipped past but didn't. I think about the physical environments that had historically produced this kind of encounter. A used bookstore where you cannot search, you can only walk slowly and look, and something catches your eye based on a cover, a spine, a single word on a title you have never heard of. A library where the books you came looking for happen to live on the same shelf as books you were not looking for at all. A late-night radio program playing something you would never have chosen but find yourself unable to stop listening to. Those spaces were full of noise, in the best sense of the word. Irrelevant signals mixed in with relevant ones, all coexisting without hierarchy. And occasionally, more than occasionally if you were paying even a little attention, the irrelevant signal turned out to be the thing that shifted something in you. The algorithm is quiet in comparison, precise. It removes the noise, which is exactly what makes it feel so clean, so useful, so obviously superior to the old way of wandering through information. But noise and signal are not always opposites. Sometimes the noise is the signal. Sometimes the thing that was not intended for you is the most important thing you could have found. There is something in how the brain actually works that supports this. Insight, the sudden sense that pieces have connected, that something previously opaque has become clear, rarely arises through sustained direct focus. It tends to appear during the unfocused moments.
The walk, the long drive, the pause between tasks when the mind is technically idle and actually doing some of its most interesting work. Peripheral attention is not distraction. It is a different mode of processing entirely. And when you eliminate it in favor of efficiency, when everything in your environment is optimized for relevance, for center frame clarity, for giving you exactly what you came for, you do not just lose the noise, you lose the conditions under which certain kinds of thinking can happen at all. The edges of your attention are not wasted space. For a lot of people, they are where the best things come from.
Before the feed, there was someone deciding what you saw. Not an algorithm, a person. A record store clerk who would pull something from behind the counter and say, "You like that? Try this." A librarian who knew the collection well enough to draw a connection you never would have arrived at on your own. A magazine editor who had to decide, with finite pages and no engagement data whatsoever, what was worth putting in front of readers that month. These people were not neutral. They had taste. They had blind spots and personal enthusiasms that leaked into their work in ways they probably could not always explain. And that subjectivity, which looks like a design flaw from a certain angle, was also where a lot of the most interesting moments lived. The unexpected recommendation, the thing pressed into your hands by someone who simply had a feeling about it. There is a word for what they were doing: curation. Not in the diluted way the word gets used now, where everything from a playlist to a sponsored content collection gets called curated, but in the older sense, to care for, to tend, to select with genuine intention and some real knowledge of the person on the receiving end. What made human curation different from what we have now is not easy to pin down precisely, but I think it comes down to something like this. The curator was also changed by the encounter. The record store clerk who handed you an album had listened to it, had felt something about it, had made a decision based on that feeling and some intuitive read of who you were that it might land differently for you than it did for the last person who came in. The recommendation was relational. It carried context that neither party could fully articulate, and it moved in both directions. Algorithms recommend based on pattern. Humans recommend based on something closer to intuition, which is itself a kind of compressed experience, but with a crucial difference. It is embodied, it carries weight, it is accountable in a way that a ranked list simply is not. When the clerk was wrong, you could tell them. When the editor missed the mark, readers let them know. There was a feedback loop with an actual human being in it, which meant the curation could evolve in response to something far more nuanced than watch time and click-through rates. I am not arguing that we return to a world of gatekeepers deciding. Before the feed, there was someone deciding what you saw. Not an algorithm, a person. A record store clerk who would pull something from behind the counter and say, "You like that? Try this." A librarian who knew the collection well enough to draw a connection you never would have arrived at on your own. A magazine editor who had to decide, with finite pages and no engagement data whatsoever, what was worth putting in front of readers that month. These people were not neutral. They had taste. They had blind spots and personal enthusiasms that leaked into their work in ways they probably could not always explain. And that subjectivity, which looks like a design flaw from a certain angle, was also where a lot of the most interesting moments lived. The unexpected recommendation, the thing pressed into your hands by someone who simply had a feeling about it. There is a word for what they were doing: curation. Not in the diluted way the word gets used now, where everything from a playlist to a sponsored content collection gets called curated, but in the older sense, to care for, to tend, to select with genuine intention and some real knowledge of the person on the receiving end. What made human curation different from what we have now is not easy to pin down precisely, but I think it comes down to something like this. The curator was also changed by the encounter. The record store clerk who handed you an album had listened to it, had felt something about it, had made a decision based on that feeling and some intuitive read of who you were that it might land differently for you than it did for the last person who came in.
The recommendation was relational. It carried context that neither party could fully articulate, and it moved in both directions. Algorithms recommend based on pattern. Humans recommend based on something closer to intuition, which is itself a kind of compressed experience, but with a crucial difference. It is embodied, it carries weight, it is accountable in a way that a ranked list simply is not. When the clerk was wrong, you could tell them. When the editor missed the mark, readers let them know. There was a feedback loop with an actual human being in it, which meant the curation could evolve in response to something far more nuanced than watch time and click-through rates. I am not arguing that we return to a world of gatekeepers deciding which ideas deserve to reach people. That was its own kind of problem, its own exclusions, its own structural blind spots that kept entire voices from being heard at all. But something shifted in the transition that we have not fully sat with yet. The scale of algorithmic curation is genuinely extraordinary. The reach is global, the speed is instant, the personalization goes far deeper than any individual human curator could manage. And yet the experience of receiving a recommendation from a machine feels categorically different from receiving one from a person who has actually thought about you. Maybe what is missing is risk. When someone recommends something to you personally, they are extending something of themselves. They are saying, I think this will matter to you, and I am willing to be wrong about that. That small act of vulnerability is part of what gives the recommendation its weight. It signals that the person has considered you specifically, not just processed your behavioral data. A feed has no stake in whether what it surfaces turns out to mean anything to you. It just observes what happens next and recalibrates. There is no one on the other end. And sometimes that absence, quiet, invisible, and perfectly frictionless, is the thing you notice most. We measure almost everything about how people interact with content online. Time spent, clicks, shares, return visits, scroll depth, whether you paused on something and for exactly how long, and whether that pause suggested you might come back. The instrumentation is extraordinary. The granularity of what gets tracked today would have seemed like science fiction to someone sitting at a computer 20 years ago. But there is a question underneath all of that measurement that none of the metrics actually touch. Were you better for it? Not more informed in some quantifiable sense, not exposed to a higher volume of content per session, but genuinely, did the time you spent there move something in you? Did it open something or quietly close something? Did you leave more curious than when you arrived, or did you leave slightly flatter, the way you sometimes feel after spending too long in a room with no windows? Engagement as a metric captures attention. It does not capture what attention does to you over time, and those are not the same thing at all. I have been sitting with the idea of what it would mean to optimize for something else. Not engagement, but what you might call resonance. The quality of an encounter with an idea that leaves a trace, that surfaces unexpectedly in a conversation 3 weeks later, that makes you look at something familiar and suddenly see it at a different angle. Resonance does not register on a dashboard. It lives in the space between the experience and what the experience quietly made possible afterward, in a different mood, different context, a moment you were not expecting. The problem is that resonance is slow. Engagement is immediate. You can measure it in real time, iterate overnight, tighten the feedback loop until you can predict with reasonable confidence what will hold attention in a given environment. Resonance might not surface for days or weeks or years. It might not surface in any form you can point to at all, just a slow structural shift in how you hold a certain idea, a change in the texture of how you think. That kind of effect is essentially invisible to every system we have built to evaluate what is working, which creates a distortion that is easy to miss because it is so quiet. The content that performs best on engagement metrics is not necessarily the content that does the most for the people who spend time with it. It is the content best suited for the conditions the platform has created, the pace, the emotional register, the format that holds attention most reliably in that specific environment. And the platform, having no mechanism for measuring resonance and no structural incentive to develop one, simply cannot tell the difference.
It knows what kept people there. That is the signal it was built by. This problem shows up in other fields in ways we recognize more readily. A doctor who only assessed how patients felt in the hours after treatment would miss most of what actually matters about whether it was working. A teacher evaluated purely on how engaging students found the class would be optimizing for something adjacent to learning but not identical to it. We understand in those contexts that the metric and the thing you actually care about are not the same thing, and that collapsing one into the other quietly costs you something. I do not think the answer is to stop measuring. Resonance is genuinely difficult to quantify, and ambiguity is not a strategy. But there is something worth holding on to in simply naming the gap and keeping it visible rather than letting it seal over. Because the moment you accept engagement as a good enough stand-in for meaning, you have already made a decision about what kind of experience is worth building toward and what kind is worth spending your life's attention on. And that decision, once it settles in, tends not to announce itself. It just becomes the way things are. There is a particular kind of afternoon I keep coming back to. No destination, no task waiting on the other end, just walking, and at some point, not quite knowing where you are. Not lost in any way that would cause concern, but genuinely without a plan for the next turn or the one after that. There is a quality to that state that is almost impossible to manufacture deliberately. The moment you announce to yourself that you are going to wander, you have already imposed a kind of structure on it, a frame, an intention. Real wandering happens when you stop tracking. I think about that in relation to how we move through information now. We have access to more ideas, more voices, more accumulated knowledge than any previous generation could have imagined standing in front of. And yet, the experience of moving through it often feels less like wandering and more like being routed. Our browsing has become purposeful in a way that forecloses something. You open a tab with an intention. The intention gets satisfied or it does not. Either way, you close the tab. There is rarely a middle state, the digital equivalent of taking a wrong turn and discovering something you did not know existed 2 blocks from where you thought you were going. What I keep returning to is whether intentional lostness is something you can actually practice. Not as a productivity strategy, not as a creativity exercise with measurable outputs at the end, but as a genuine philosophical stance, a decision to occasionally move through information without an agenda, and to stay with whatever that surfaces without immediately asking what it is for or where it leads. Some of this is simply about permission. We have quietly absorbed the idea that time spent online should be purposeful, that browsing without clear direction is a kind of waste, a failure of focus that better habits or better tools should correct. But some of the most fertile intellectual territory I have wandered into arrived through what would have looked from the outside like pure aimlessness, a link followed for no particular reason. A topic cracked open out of mild curiosity with no intention of going anywhere with it. The aimlessness was the condition, not the obstacle. There is a concept in Japanese aesthetics called ma, the idea of meaningful negative space, the pause, the interval, the empty room that allows what is inside it to actually be seen, the silence between notes that makes the music possible. I wonder sometimes if intentional wandering functions like that for the mind. Not the absence of thinking, but the interval in which a different kind of thinking becomes possible. The space between directed attention and whatever quietly arrives when directed attention finally lets go. You cannot schedule that. You cannot optimize for it or build a productivity system around it without immediately defeating the point. But you can create the conditions. You can decide on a given afternoon that you are going to move through something. A walk, a bookstore, a corner of the internet you have never deliberately visited without needing to arrive anywhere in particular. And then stay in that state long enough for something unexpected to find you.
It requires a genuine tolerance for not knowing what you are doing or why, which, in a culture that treats purposefulness as a core virtue and aimlessness as a character flaw worth correcting, turns out to be a harder practice than it sounds. But the ideas that have surprised me most, the ones that landed somewhere genuinely new, almost never came from going exactly where I had planned to go. They came from the moment when I had no particular plan at all.
Somewhere in a data center, there's a version of you. Not you exactly, more like a silhouette, an outline assembled from the residue of thousands of small decisions made across years of being online. The articles you opened and the ones you closed after 3 seconds. The searches you ran at 2 in the morning that you would not necessarily mention in conversation. The phase you went through at 24 that you have mostly moved past but that the record kept anyway, filed away quietly, still informing what gets shown to you. This version of you does not know you changed. It knows who you were when you were clicking. There is something quietly strange about that. The idea that somewhere, a portrait of you is continuously being updated, but only in one direction. It grows more detailed with time. It does not grow more accurate in the ways that actually matter. Identity in the lived sense is not a fixed thing. You contain contradictions. You hold opinions you have not fully tested against the world yet. You are genuinely interested in things that do not fit neatly into the pattern of what interested you last year. And you have shed other interests quietly, without announcement or ceremony. You change between versions of yourself the way a city changes, incrementally, sometimes dramatically, and in ways that are only fully legible from a distance. The data profile does not work like that. It accumulates, it calculates, it draws a line from your past behavior toward a prediction about your future behavior. And it is often right, because most of the time, people do behave with some consistency. Patterns are real. The algorithm is not wrong to look for them. But what it cannot account for is the exception, the moment of genuine departure, the version of you that encounters something completely outside your established territory and is altered in a way that no prior data point could have predicted or prepared for. What I find worth sitting with is how the system's accuracy can quietly become a kind of ceiling. When a recommendation engine is very good at predicting what you will engage with, it is also, by definition, very good at keeping you close to what you have already been. The prediction becomes a prescription, and the prescription, delivered consistently enough across enough surfaces of your digital life, begins to feel less like a suggestion and more like a description of who you are. This is not a conspiracy. It does not require anyone to have intended it. It is the logical consequence of building systems that optimize for what they can measure. And what they can measure is always the past. The past is abundant, specific, and retrievable. What you might become is none of those things. I think about the experiences that have most changed how I see myself, not in small calibrations, but in the deeper structural sense. Almost none of them were predictable from the person I was immediately before they happened. A book that arrived at what seemed like the wrong time and somehow turned out to be exactly the right one. A conversation that wandered somewhere neither person had intended to go. An interest that began as a casual detour and slowly became central to how I think about almost everything. The profile built on who I was before those moments would not have gone looking for any of them. And in an environment that is precisely calibrated to that profile, surfacing what fits, filtering what does not, it becomes a question worth asking slowly. How many of those turning points would have simply been routed around? And how many versions of yourself are still out there somewhere, waiting for the right wrong turn to find them? We started with an experiment. 30 days of navigating directly. No feeds, no algorithms, no content that arrived without being asked for. What began as a kind of test became something closer to a reminder. A reminder that the act of choosing changes what you find. That friction is not always waste. That the mirror the system holds up is accurate about your past and silent about your future. That the edges of your attention are where a great deal of the most interesting things quietly wait. That a recommendation from someone who has thought about you carries something a ranked list cannot. That engagement and meaning are not the same measurement. That wandering without a destination is not a failure of intention. It might be one of the more productive things you can do with an afternoon. And that somewhere in a data center, there is a portrait of you that stopped updating in the ways that matter most. None of this resolved into a clean conclusion. I did not come out of that 30-day experiment with a philosophy or a system or a set of rules for better digital living. What I came out with was something more like an awareness, a slightly altered sense of where I end and where the architecture around me begins. That gap is easy to lose track of. The systems are designed to make it invisible, not out of malice, but because invisible is what seamless looks like from the inside. What I keep thinking about, threading all of this together, is something simple. The shape of your attention shapes the shape of your life. Not in some grand metaphysical sense, just practically, actually, in the accumulated texture of what you encounter and what you carry away from it, what you let in, what gets filtered out before you ever have a chance to decide whether you wanted it. We have handed a remarkable amount of that shaping over to systems that are very good at certain things and structurally blind to others. That is not a reason for alarm, it is a reason for awareness. There is a version of this that goes wrong in either direction. The person's so suspicious of technology that they treat every algorithm as an adversary, and the person so absorbed in the frictionless current that the question of who is doing the choosing never quite surfaces. What I am after is something in between, the kind of relationship with your tools where you are genuinely using them, not being used by them, not performing a principled rejection of them, but holding them lightly enough that you can put them down when putting them down is what the moment asks for. That requires a certain quality of attention. Not more effort, necessarily, just more consciousness about the difference between where you chose to go and where you were carried, between what you found and what found you. The experiment ended. I went back to the feeds. Of course I did. They're useful. They are where a lot of life happens now, and I was not interested in purity as a destination. But something had shifted in the quality of how I moved through them. A little more awake, a little more aware of the current. Still swimming, just with a slightly better sense of which direction is my own. So I want to leave you with this, and I mean it as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. When you think about the ideas and experiences that have most changed how you see things, the ones that arrived unexpectedly, the ones you never would have searched for, how many of them found you because you were somewhere the algorithm did not put you? And what would it mean to protect a little more space for that?